Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia, and I guess this episode could be looked at as part of maybe a trilogy or more about America's entry into World War II, especially into Western Europe and the Mediterranean. The first episode of that series is obviously the overpaid, oversexed, and overhear episode. If you haven't caught that one, I'd run back and just check it out because it goes over that early arrival of American troops into the UK, and it's a pretty good start point for the series. But this episode is going to be focused on the 1st Ranger Battalion, its formation, and eventual deployment to North Africa. And I think it'll be of particular interest to folks who kind of lean into the special operations type forces in World War II. I have a lot of friends who are modern day Rangers, guys that served, any time from the Vietnam lettered Ranger companies all the way up to modern day. And I've always been struck as a Marine for their embracing of their history, and that's something obviously as Marines do really well. So it's something that you can find a lot of common ground between the two forces, and so I wanted to take a look at it. And originally, I was going to do an episode on like the entire involvement in North Africa by the Rangers, but I figured it would probably outstrip my own personal time constraints for this particular episode. But it also allowed me to go back and look at the genesis of the Rangers, because despite their fantastic performance in North Africa, especially in the initial assault for Operation Torch, it really there's so much material there, and there's so many interesting things to look at in terms of their formation and how they get from um, standing the unit up all the way through to that deployment into North Africa. And so we're gonna take a step back and we're gonna look at it. And we're gonna start. For those of you watching on YouTube, obviously there's going to be there'll be a PowerPoint for you to view. For those of you that are listening along, I will be as descriptive as I can so that you won't miss anything. And I hope you'll keep following along. But so just a quick overview of what I'm going to cover. We're going to talk about the origins of the 1st Ranger Battalion, some of the key individuals that were involved in the formation of the battalion, its activation process, how they built the unit from scratch, the early Ranger training, the participation of some elements of the battalion in the Dieppe raid, and then the lessons learned from that raid. We're going to look at a little bit of the uniforms and equipment. I won't dive too deeply into that. There's folks that are far more informed about the minutiae of the uniforms and equipment used by the Rangers. But then we're going to talk about Operation Torch, the plan, its execution, and then the aftermath of it. And I figured what better place to start would be the origins. But I also wanted to touch on Lucian Trescott, Colonel type, and we'll talk about him in the key individuals section, and what his original thoughts about the Ranger Battalion or Rangers in general would be. And I'm going to read his quote on how he settled on the Rangers as the name of the unit, because as many of you know, the Rangers are initially modeled on the British Commandos, and discussions early on between American leadership was, well, we can't name our unit the Commandos. The British already have that, so we need something that's distinctive, but also separates these soldiers from the regular infantry divisions. So Truscott said, "I selected Rangers because few words have more glamorous connotation in American military history. It was therefore fitting that the organization destined to be the first of the American ground forces to battle Germans on the European continent in World War II should be called Rangers, in complement to those in American history who exemplified such high standards of individual courage, initiative, determination, and ruggedness, fighting ability, and achievement." So really telling right there where where Truscott's thought process was and why he chose the name that he did for the unit. Um, Interestingly, if you go back and read some of the sourcing to this and read some of Truscott's other statements, he never really thought, and most modern Rangers and Rangers, from World War II forward, have attached their lineage to Rogers Rangers, and there's nothing to say that isn't correct, but for the formation of the World War II Rangers, that was not part of the process, the thought process, from what I've been able to gather and reading. And if I'm wrong, I hope our readers will readers, our viewers and listeners will call me out on it and adjust me. But again, we're gonna touch on origins, and really, what really set off this critical thinking within the American leadership was um, actions, a series of actions, all obviously based on British actions. And the two linchpin ones are British commando actions in Norway and Operation Chariot, which I'll get into briefly. Now, I'm not going to deep dive either one of these. I'm just going to I want to lay them out there and talk about them slightly, so that folks understand where the American thought process was going forward. Um, so in this case, especially in operations in Norway, there were actually a series of 12 raids across German positions in Norway over a series of years. But the one that really caught the imagination of American leadership was Operation Claymore, which was in May of 1941. And it was a combined British and Norwegian commando raid on the Lofoten Islands off of Norway. Um, while quite a bit of damage was done to several facilities and warehouses that were there, from what I understand, the main objective was to see if they could capture an Enigma machine, which they were unsuccessful. So, but the actual action, the actual raid itself, again, caught the eye of the Americans. And then following that up in Operation Chariot in late March of 1942, where the British attacked a heavily defended Normandy dry dock at Saint Nazaire in France. Um, this again captures the imagination of the Americans in that there is a use of a very specially trained force that goes in, accomplishes a short duration mission, but does not commit the Allies to a consistent presence in those particular areas. So it's a lightning strike, a hit and out kind of operation. Now, if you want to learn more about Operation Chariot, I will recommend you go check out Paul Whittage's World War II TV channel. He did an excellent show on it with Neil Cherry. They do a great job of breaking the whole operation down. And if you really want to deep dive it, I recommend heading over there. Um, and as a side note, I'll be appearing on World War II TV in a couple of weeks, and I'll be doing we'll do at least 10 myths about Easy Company Band of Brothers. Woody's been doing a series of these myth busting shows, like the Omaha Beach myths, myths about the U.S. airborne on D-Day. We're going to do one on Easy Company. Woody's asked me to come on, and I'm looking forward to doing that. But I digress. So these are the two operations or part and parcel of the larger group of commando operations that really catch the eye of the Americans, in particular General George Marshall. He feels like this is a way for the Americans to get into combat early on without committing to a full scale invasion. It's a way to bloody his troops and get them some experience in fighting the Germans. And what he does is he tasks Colonel Lucian Trescott, who will go on to acclaim across the breadth and width of World War II because of his performance as outstanding fighting general. But before that, he gets tasked by Marshall to head out over to England and basically gauge the pulse of the American forces over there, and the British, to one, see if there's an appetite for it across the American forces, and two, to see if the British would support the standing up and assist in the training of this fledgling unit. Now, Truscott basically stated, we will we should undertake immediately the organization of a American unit along the British Commando lines. And this was his recommendation letter to Marshall in late May 1942. As a result of doing so, he's given approval by Marshall to start the process. And Truscott meets with the commander of U.S. forces in Ireland, Major General Hartle, and Hartle is supportive of the effort, so much so that he recommends that his aide de camp, a 31-year-old West Pointer named William Orlando Darby, become the first commanding officer of the 1st Ranger Battalion. And Darby comes with quite a background that you would think would be unrelated to or unrelatable to Rangers and Ranger operations or commando operations. He comes from a cavalry background, cavalry and artillery background. Now, on the initial view of it, when you look at his experience, it doesn't sound like cavalry and artillery would be a good mix for somebody to command a Ranger battalion. Now, for those of you who understand what Ranger battalions do now versus what Ranger battalions did then, they were much more of envisioned a raiding and commando force, not the special operations force multiplier that they are now, with very specific missions that that are unrelatable to what they were doing during World War II, largely. Now, Rangers still do raids, etc., but back then that was the primary focus. They would conduct raids, a limited duration raids, with a very finite objective and intent to pull them back out of the field once their missions were accomplished. Now, Darby made him was a very attractive candidate to become the commanding officer because he was also an astute student of military tactics, and he quickly learned amphibious tactics as well, because he knew, just by the nature of the positioning of U.S. forces and where they would eventually have to go, that in some capacity the Rangers would have to be involved in amphibious operations. So with that cavalry background, which was led to a lot of the cavalry thinking back then was a lot of dash and panache, but it was also a quick strike. It lacked the heavy firepower of, say, an armored division or such. And the cavalry groups back then were reconnaissance, screening, and basically used as a connective tissue between units that kind of fill that gap where two units shared a boundary, which was always the weakest point when you're trying to maintain a defense or an offense. Where the two units come together is always your weakest point. So cavalry groups were traditionally used to be the connective tissue between the units and screen ahead of their larger formations. And in that regard, Darby was well suited to become the commanding officer. And then with the artillery background, it gave him the innate ability to understand the need for supporting arms and how they would affect the battlefield. And this will be borne out in the Rangers' first initial action as a battalion, and we'll see that going forward when we get to that point. So the call goes out. They basically start slapping flyers everywhere, advertising this new unit that's going to be formed. Um, the other piece to the puzzle, and those of you looking at the slides will see it's the first bullet. They were never meant to be a long-term unit. The idea was that men would apply for the Ranger Battalion, they would serve in it for a period of time, and then they would transfer back into the larger army, bringing that skill, that expertise, and hopefully that combat experience with them to help broaden the experience and the overall abilities of the larger formations. That was the way they were originally envisioned. Now, as we all know, it didn't work out that way. The Rangers, off and on throughout U.S. military history, exist all the way through that timeline, with certain exceptions. They're initially stationed at Carrickfergus up near Belfast, and it's a very rugged area up there. The recruiting process goes on, and it's the majority of the troops that they get are from the 34th Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division. Although there's some independent anti-aircraft battalions and some other support units that also they gain volunteers from. Now, a lot of these are highly motivated, highly um, desirable troops. These, and the adverts for the unit stressed field skills, hunters, lumberjacks, specific outdoor type skills that made for very rugged individuals. But you also had some savvy unit leaders who decided, I'm going to clean out my stockade, I'm going to get rid of my malcontents. So amongst this large pool of troops comes in, you have a lot of quality individuals, and then you have some folks that, like savvy first sergeants, are trying to get off their books because they're troublemakers and they just don't want to deal with them. The volunteers that come in, they come in to the tune of almost 2,000. But by the time they do the initial screening, everything from record book screenings to to physical indoctrination periods where they're putting them through a modified training period just to see what they could take. By the time they're done weeding through all the volunteers, they get down to about 575 prospective Rangers. And even then, the intent is that they'll probably attrit more of them once the real training um, once the real training begins. So at that point, the battalion, which at the time was nicknamed the Originals, and that would carry on until, by and large, the Originals are all either incapacitated, killed, or sent home due to end of service. But the activation occurs on the 19th of June in 1942. That's the official stand-up of the 1st Ranger Battalion. And from there, they're directed to Achnacarry up in Scotland to the Commando Basic Training Center. And I apologize to any of my Scott friends if I mispronounced it, which I likely had. I'm doing the best I can, gang. Just bear with me. I'm sorry if I Americanized it. But they arrived there in July, and this is where the real training begins because they are placed under the command or under the training command of the British Commandos, the very unit that they were emulating. And in this regard, this is where the training begins, and it is hard. This training is designed to train hard men to be harder. But the initial train ups, the British Commandos are not impressed with their American brothers. And very often, especially in the officer ranks, they hear the phrase, "You're the best the Americans can offer," question mark, exclamation point. Not impressed. The two photos you can see there, they're doing some small boat handling on the left. And then you see Lieutenant Colonel Darby carrying his 1903, leading a forced march. And a forced march were a daily trial, we'll call it. This training program under the British Commandos was intended to be 3 months long. And over those 3 months, they would whittle them down to the actual battalion. So the 575 would be whittled down to a much more manageable number. The training program consisted of a very strenuous physical fitness program, daily 25-mile speed marches. And if you're looking at this on YouTube, you can see the picture of Darby. He's carrying his belt order and his haversack and his rifle, helmet, and boots with leggings. So it wasn't they were required to carry their full order. It also included live fire exercises, multiple runs through the obstacle courses, weapons and hand-to-hand combat training, small boat handling, and amphibious assault training, which began later in August of 42. So all of this is jam-packed into that training, and it was very strenuous. The environmental conditions were horrible up in Scotland. The guys were constantly wet. Their feet were constantly pruning. Their hands were pruning. Their gear was always wet and soggy, and it was very hard to get dry. And you were always on your feet. Guys talked about getting blisters on blisters. I mean, it was a very rugged training, and it was meant to weed out the people who weren't hardy enough to handle what was going to be coming at them. And this 3-month period, over that 3-month period, they managed to attrit the 575 down to 473 officers and enlisted men. Now, once this is done, they start task organizing. They're originally task organized into companies, but by the end of it, they're able to do a correct task organization. And unlike the normal rifle companies in a infantry division, they didn't have like 150 men assigned to it. They were between 63 and 67 men, and that includes officers and enlisted. But once they finally get through the training and their tasks organized correctly, they're directed to Argyll, Scotland, where they undergo that amphibious training in August. And this is where they get exposed to operating in like LCAs, more additional small boat handling, ship to shore operations. And they start to learn they start to experiment with the proper mix of how to load their LCAs, landing craft assaults. Um, and during this time, discussions go on about how to get the American Rangers some combat experience. And finally, the discussions lead to the thought that Rangers would participate in that upcoming raid at Dieppe. Again, this is 19 August when the raid begins. Um, the total amount of Rangers that are signed is a very small part of the battalion. 4 officers and 41 enlisted Rangers attached to number 3 and number 4 commando, and 2 officers and 4 enlisted going in with the main assault with the Canadian forces. I won't go over the Dieppe operation in detail. You can see the map there on the left um, and on the right flanks of the main assault is where the commandos went in. So the bulk of the Rangers went in on those 2 missions. And then um, the 6 other Rangers went in with the main assault there up in the center of the action. I'd recommend World War II TV. There's several programs that Woody has done on Dieppe, or historian David O'Keefe has written extensively about the Dieppe raid. You can go into detail. But as a result of the raid, 3 Rangers are killed, 2 officers and 1 enlisted, and several are captured. And they're actually kind of considered celebrities in German captivity for a little while. But two of the men that take part in it, John Murray, who he was a company commander in 1st Battalion, and he ends up becoming the commanding officer of another battalion. He's battlefield commissioned to lieutenant colonel later on. Survives the war, has written extensively, and I believe his son is on Facebook and frequents a number of the Ranger pages. And you can engage him. He loves to talk about his father. Another one is Franklin Coons, Sergeant Franklin Coons. He was decorated with the British Military Medal by Lord Mountbatten. So I mean, and again, these guys go back to the Ranger Battalion. Again, that whole idea that the Rangers would serve in combat and go back to the larger force and provide them insights and their experience in combat. And that's how they would broaden the combat experience of the larger American force. Well, in this case, they don't go back to their divisions; they go back to the 1st Ranger Battalion, and they form like a little cadre within the cadre of men that have seen the elephant, and then come back and discuss these um, their actions. But in large, the other Rangers who did not deploy to the Dieppe raid found that these men, and you can see the quote there, these Rangers looked older, weary, and deadly serious. You can see Sergeant Alex Zima on the left. He's getting a light from Sergeant Bunny Austin, the number 4 commando. Zima was a fairly popular Ranger with the Brits. At one point, prior to the Dieppe raid, they were had a break from training and they were in a pub drinking. And Zima kind of insulted the Brits a little bit because they were kind of insulting him a little bit. But at the end of the day, because he got paid so much more money than his Brit equivalents did, he ended up buying extra whiskey for rounds for everybody, and it made him a very popular guy. Um, but that wasn't the the lessons that learn that come that are learned that come out of the DEP mission are uh, that the Rangers need to expand their amphibious operations training. It needs to be more and better. Uh, Darby realizes early on, based on the input from his Rangers that had deployed, that while um, what the amphibious training they had done had been of value, they need to do it more often, and they need to do it in better and grander scope, and in participation with larger elements, so that they can know where they stand in the force order, and where they're going in terms of the difficulties of deploying as part of that larger force. And some of that will be borne out going into Operation Torch. Um, they also need an improved planning process for operations. Many of the Rangers sounded off about how they felt like they were just kind of being dragged along with the larger force and sucked into their plans, when the larger force didn't really have a good understanding about how to utilize them. So many of the Rangers talked about how they needed an improved planning process, not just for themselves, but how they integrate into the larger forces. Um, they also understood, definitely after Dieppe, that one of the key attributes of Ranger observations, or several key attributes, should be speed, surprise, and shock. Because they are a smaller force and they lack the larger, heavier organic weapons that a larger unit would have, they need to compensate for that by attacking with speed and surprise and shocking the enemy, so that even though they'll have limited numbers, it allow them to overpower defenders on raids rapidly, um, before they realize that they actually have the Rangers outnumbered. They also stress the need for hard, realistic training, including more live fire exercises. Many of them talked about how the live fire exercises really help them to um, withstand the shock of opening battle, the opening shock of battle, when those first rounds start cracking over your head. When you know there's a German on the other side of the weapon that's trying to kill you, it helped them to deal with that by having live fire exercises and that hard, realistic training that they had been through. Some of them even said it was almost easier than the training we had gone through with the commandos back in July, starting in July of 42. And lastly, they said improved intelligence on the targets themselves, and I think that's part and parcel to the broader Dieppe raid, in terms of the intelligence picture that was presented to the Canadians, the British, the Americans. And again, the Americans are bit players, but then they, again, and I talked about it briefly, they come back and they're a bit, there's a bit of celebrity status assigned to the Rangers as the first American forces to engage the Germans in Western Europe. Many of them are interviewed. They end up in news articles. The audio recordings of their interviews end up being played back in the States, and they become celebrities. And a lot of these guys didn't want to be celebrities. They just wanted to go back to their battalion and continue to train because they knew they had a job to do. The one raid was not going to be all it was um, for them, and they knew it, and they just wanted to get back to the task in hand. Now, some of them accepted it and enjoyed it. It was something that they enjoyed the limelight a little bit, and they enjoyed getting drinks bought for them by their buddies, and they enjoyed that little bit of celebrity, especially if it came attached with you know some extra dates from some of the girls around the areas where they were stationed. But by and large, um, most of the guys just wanted to get back to the task at hand. They wanted a little bit of leave, and then they wanted to go back to training with their buddies and getting ready for the next mission. Um, you also started to see some refinements in the equipment, and we talked about the belt order and the knapsack, and that is largely unchanged from what the regular infantry were using. But we see a refinement in the HPT, the herringbone twill utilities that the Rangers end up wearing. They end up modifying their own gear, cutting down their leggings a little bit so they're a little bit more functional, and they don't come up as far up the side of the leg. The use of arm brassards, and you'll see this in North Africa. They wear it as a recognition signal. Uh, One, to other allied forces, but two, in hopes that maybe the French won't fire on them if they see they're Americans. And lastly, the Fairburn Sykes commando knife, seen on the lower right, becomes kind of a representative weapon for the Rangers. Um, and many of them do carry those into battle for the rest of the war. Um, but that leads to, all this has led up to the point where they're going to be deployed finally, as part of as a part of a broader invasion force, but they'll be fully constituted as a battalion. They won't be going out and piecemealed into other units, not in the same vein as Dieppe. So in this, they really don't know what the next mission is. At the time, Darby had been training for raids in Norway. As I showed on that origin slide, there were a dozen raids that the British Commandos made to Norway. Darby was under the impression that him and the First Ranger Battalion might be used the same way, but come to find out later on that they end up being assigned to the Allied forces going into North Africa, Operation Torch. The battalion gets attached to the 1st Infantry Division. Terry de la Mesa Allen is the division commander for the 1st Infantry Division. And General Roosevelt is his assistant division commander. And the Rangers are attached to them for a very specific mission. The port town of Arzew possesses 2 French artillery batteries, and in order to ensure that the 1st Infantry Division is not landing into a hellscape covered by multiple artillery batteries, the Rangers are assigned the mission of going in early in the amphibious landings and taking out the 2 batteries to ensure that the big red one doesn't land in the middle of an artillery fire sack when they come in. So the Rangers themselves have no idea what the actual target is at this point when they're embarked. It's only during the cross-Atlantic movement that they're informed of the mission, and they're told they're going to be conducting the two landings. One will be the main assault, the other will be the supporting assault. The 2 batteries are in the town. If you're looking at this on YouTube, you can see them. They're labeled 1 and 2. The 1st Battalion's executive officer, Major Herman Damer, will lead a 2-company assault on Fort de la Pointe. That's number 1 on the map. And the 2nd force, led by Darby, would land up near Cape Carbon. They would make their way down to north of the town, the port town, and attack the Fort du Nord. Fort de la Pointe possessed 3 75mm cannons manned by a French artillery unit, along with supporting infantrymen. And the Fort du Nord possessed 4 105mm guns, and again, manned by the French artillerymen and supported by French infantrymen. And what's interesting about this is, if you have it, you can almost read along with with the after action report, which for our paid Patreon our paid Patreon supporters, I'll post it up on our Patreon page so you can take a look at it. But so the Rangers are embarked with the rest of the amphibious assault group. They make their way off the coast of Arzew, and they begin boarding their LCAs late on the evening of 7 November 1942, and they're slightly behind schedule. The British had put guide boats out, and so they finally make their way to their guide boat. Darby's force in particular, slightly behind schedule, but still within tolerances. And the landings begin at 1:30 hours, and they make their way in. And for those of you, again, looking at this on YouTube, you can see the map. Cape Carbon is all the way up northwest of the city. Now, once they make their landings, they follow the coast road all the way down towards the main outcropping north of Arzew, and from there they're able to find once they land on the bluffs and make their way up the coast road, they find their way up to this crevasse that leads up to the hill. And so in order to ensure that Major Damer is not walking into a kill zone with his assault force of A and B Company, Darby deploys C, D, E, and F companies abreast. pulling, but then he ends up, as they get up the ravine towards where the main position is of the battery, he pulls D Company back and has them set up their 481 mm mortars, and they're in defilade too, so the French can't see the mortars being set up, and he gets his men up, and they're about 500 yards from the enemy position, to the rear of the enemy position, and the French are not expecting to be attacked from the rear. Now, each company puts out their scouts, and they make their way up to the perimeter of the French position, and it is barbed wire encircling the entire position. But the scouts are able to make multiple cuts into the position without being noticed. Um, but as the companies start to move up to their assault positions near the wire, they begin taking heavy rifle and machine gun fire. Darby conducts a call for fire with his 81 mm, and this suppresses the fire long enough um, for C, E, and F to rush through the gaps in the wire, and they eventually overrun the guns and capture 60 prisoners. They move about the position and prepare the guns for demolition, but don't blow them in case they're needed. Now, that's interesting. Those of you who listen to my Holdy pod, you'll know that several of the guns at Holdy were destroyed, and then Colonel Sink basically radioed up and said, "Hey, don't destroy the guns. The 377th has not been able to locate their howitzers, and we might need these guns for them." So, but he calls a little too late, and they're only able to salvage one gun. In this case, they're able to salvage all four guns, but they prepare them for demolition because, again, the Rangers are a light force. Each of those companies only have about 60 plus Rangers. So they know they could probably get swept right off these bluffs, right back off into the sea. So he prepares them for demolition in case they're about to be overrun. They can blow the guns so they can't be turned around on them. But he also pushes out his outposts. These screening outposts will provide an early tripwire if they are counterattacked. Now, while all this is happening, Dammer assaults with his group, A and B Company, going into the port. Um, they go in completely in surprise. They eliminate two sentries using those Fairburn Sykes commando daggers, and they take 50 prisoners and overrun the three guns in that battery. There's hardly any firing during the assault by A and B Company. It is almost a complete surprise. Now, really, this is not the end of Ranger actions in Operation Torch, but in this case, we're gonna we're going to kind of stop it here because we're going to talk about the aftermath. And really, to me, this might be some of the most important parts to it, because the Rangers do go on to continue conducting actions um, during their time in North Africa. But part of that is part of the aftermath and lessons learned. But I will say, um, once the area is secured, Darby, ever the taskmaster, who is still beloved by his men, orders that they go into a rigorous training um, regimen while they're there in sort of the rear areas, because they remain in Arzew, even though, well, they conduct a few actions outside of the area, and then they're brought back to Arzew to kind of secure it. But that's where Darby uses as basically a training hub for his men. Um, and as you can see, if you're looking at this on YouTube, if you're not, the battalion continues fighting around Algeria and into Tunisia, and this kind of sets the seeds, this plants the seeds for how Rangers view how they are used by the larger forces. And frankly, they believe they are ill used by conventional forces. And we see this a lot when we talk about the airborne usage during World War II. They end up getting thrown into places and used as line infantry. When they are obviously very specialized troops with specialized training, they are not easy to replicate. And the idea is that once the Rangers had secured their objectives, they should be pulled back out, refitted with equipment, and remanned to be brought back up to speed to deal with casualties, and then train again to be ready for the next mission. And then, and we can see this template in thought wanting to be applied to the airborne forces, especially after Normandy and Holland, as they go forward through the European campaign. but they're not. They end up being used almost like as another conventional infantry unit. And this is not to disparage conventional, infantry divisions and their units. And those men, and I can tell you from spending a lot of time with the airborne guys from World War II, many of them in their older age, when they had a chance to kind of mature a little bit, especially their outlook about the other forces they were fighting along with. One, they always believed they were just part of a larger force. But two, many of them, and I'll use Buck Compton as an example, and Buck and I talked quite often about the use of airborne and how they're eventually pulled out while the guys on the line stay out on the line with no hope for withdrawal, at least for any length of time. Sometimes you get a rest and refit period of a day or two or three, where you come off the line, and then you're back in it again. And he always talked with great admiration for the guys who spent time in line infantry units. And but there is a tendency, when there was a lack of troops, for conventional commanders to use special units like Rangers and Airborne to fill the gaps in the line. In this case, the battalion was kind of parsed out between the 16th and 18th infantry regiments, and they were used as kind of a screening reconnaissance unit in front of those two regiments. And it's not to say that those are not part of the Ranger missions. Again, they did a lot of training and scouting, but not nearly as much as you would think. Again, they're more trained as a raiding force and not a scouting force like, say, your normal cavalry units. Um, but they're there, and Darby had been told, you will support the 16th and 18th regiments, and that's what he did. He parsed his battalions down into pieces and assigned them to the 16th and 18th, and that's what they're used for throughout the fighting in Algeria and into Tunisia. And they're finally withdrawn. And again, that thought process of, are we going to be abused if we get put underneath a conventional commander, will live with the Rangers all the way until modern day almost. It never really goes away. Um, they also learn they have to increase the emphasis on training for scouting missions. They know if they are going to get slotted alongside conventional military units, or opcon as we call it, operationally uh, commanded or operationally controlled by a conventional unit, that they may indeed be used as scouts, then they need to be better trained for scouting missions. And lastly, the broad thought early on of Marshall and Truscott that the Rangers would go back and be these voices of experience and a combat experience, and use that experience and that wisdom to train future Rangers, comes to fruition throughout the war as they stand up to 6 Ranger battalions across the timeline of the war. In both Europe and the Pacific. And these Rangers go on to conduct many memorable missions. Of course, almost everybody knows about the Kobuanitan prisoner camp raid, Point du Hoc, the fighting in Italy, where one of the Ranger battalions is almost wiped out, or taken prisoner. I mean, this is again, Rangers being used improperly like a conventional unit instead of the raid/commando force that they were. But at the end of the day, as I like to say with friends at work, you can't tell the boss you don't do windows when you're a window washer. And in this case, the Rangers took the missions as they came. Um, it's no good if you train your highly trained organization and all you are is a palace guard. Um, and so the Rangers will go on and complete all of these and conduct all these amazing operations, and obviously we're still talking about some of these actions to this day, um, and that just goes to show you that the quality of the men and the quality of missions that they were on and their conduct of those missions, um, they keep capturing imagination all the way to this day, that we're still talking about it 80 plus years down the road. And obviously the Rangers of now, of today, and all the way through from World War II, the Ranger companies in Korea, the LRP and Ranger units in Vietnam, and then the modern day Rangers, which stood up in 74, First Battalion stands back up in 74. All of these fall in on that lineage that started back in World War II. And it's even reflected in the current uniform with the badge of Merrill's Marauders. Um, and the 75th Rangers is all baked into the Rangers, the original Rangers that formed in 1942. And so I hope everybody has enjoyed this episode. Again, we're on YouTube, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can find us on Buzzsprout, and a whole other different pile of podcatchers out there. We do have a Patreon page, as I mentioned in the beginning. If you want to become a Patreon subscriber, it's $3 a month. You get all kinds of extras. You get access to files and photos that are just for the paid subscribers. And then obviously you get access to all of our podcasts, including the ones that are just made for our Patreon subscribers. $3, small price to pay to help keep the lights on and keep the pod running. And I hope everybody's enjoyed this. Coming up, I'll be recording episode 28 with Bob Koenigs. We'll be talking about the battles for Manet and Grand Minel during the Battle of the Bulge. I'm gonna ping Bob soon and talk to him. I want to obviously cover Barak da Fracture, Parker's Crossroads, which is kind of the precursor that kind of feeds the battles at Manet and Grand Minel. It's going to be a dynamite show. Bob is really the subject matter expert. He lives in that area. It is part of his personal history, and having texted with him quite often and read a lot of his things and seen a lot of his posts. He's dynamite. We're all going to enjoy that show. And then on the 22nd, I believe it'll pop on the 22nd. I'll be appearing on World War II TV with Paul Woodage. We'll be doing that show on the 10 myths of at least 10. I might try and talk him into to 10 or to 12 or 15, depending on how long he wants to go, because I know Woody likes to record multiple shows a day. We'll see how that goes. His last 10 myths about the airborne on D-Day was a 2-hour show. It was dynamite. I'm thankful he didn't talk about a lot of Band of Brothers stuff, because we're probably going to cover it in hours. And it was also nice to see he was using a document I sent him about the Gliderman. If you're a paid subscriber, many moons back, I posted up an article I wrote about the disparity between what the paratroopers thought about the glider performance and then the glider pilots, and the troop carrier pilots' view of their own performance, and how the two did not intersect, and then how once they were able to talk with each other, especially, and I use the example of one 101st Airborne paratrooper and the troop carrier pilot that flew him into Normandy. Once the pilot was able to sit there with him many years after the fact and explain what had happened to him, why the jump went the way it did, the hatred and animosity that the paratrooper had for the aircrew dissipated, because then he could understand why the ride was so rough. And it's really dynamite. If you get a chance, again, if you're a paid subscriber, go back through our Patreon page. You can find it very easily. And I recommend reading it, especially if you're going to watch some of Woody's shows. A lot of shows out there don't talk about the quote unquote the competition. I'm out here to fully support folks like Woody and Al Murray and Jim Holland with the We Have Ways pod, which I love to death. Again, have no problem supporting them. And if you haven't gone back and listened to the episode 26, the Operation Pegasus podcast with Edwin Popkin and Joe Hook, I highly recommend it. We spent about 15 or 20 minutes talking about the Holocaust and Auschwitz, and then we deep dive into Operation Pegasus, and it's really a dynamite show. But anyway, I think I've been rambling on for close to an hour now. I want to let everybody go. I hope you've enjoyed it. And for my buddies, my Ranger buddies out there, Rangers lead the way. Thanks.